everybody. Um, this is an episode of The Finish Line. I'm making this sound like it's a radio broadcast, but in a way, that's kind of how I thought about it as a conversation with call-in options, so to speak. And the idea here is that the faculty we have on campus, especially in the Department of History, knows a good deal about writing. And the grad students amongst you are all facing writing challenges of one kind or another. Some of you are preparing a thesis, some of you are currently in a reading seminar or research seminar facing a writing challenge. Some of you will be preparing an exit exam in a subject field or are working on a project. So writing is part of your graduate student experience, and it will predictably be part of your professional career as well. And we often make it look in our seminars like this is something that we all know how to do and we're teaching you, and if only you were as smart as us. The truth, of course, is that all of us as faculty were graduate students once, and we are all still in the process of learning how to write. This is something that never ends. And I think it's maybe the most genuine expression of this principle or this guiding mission that we have on campus, and that is lifelong learning. This often sounds like a nice thing to say, but something that we may preach more than we practice. But in writing, this is very literally true. So today, we're going to be talking to Professor Alison Varzally, and Professor Alison Varzally actually is my colleague. We arrived at Cal State Fullerton at the same time in 2005, and since then I will say Alison now for in short, because we've known each other for 15 years. Has been extremely prolific. She has written in the field of immigration, multiracial relations, and the American West. And her first book, Making a Non-White America, Californians Coloring Outside Ethnic Lines, was a stunning success in 2008 and won an award as the Immigration and Ethnic History Society's Best Book of 2008. Her second book that came out in 2017 is called Children of Reunion, Vietnamese Adoptions and the Politics of Family Migrations. And that book explores the lives and stories of Vietnamese children and the American and Vietnamese families. And both books then clearly deal with issues of race and ethnicity, a topic very much in need and demand today. Of course, most of you know Professor Varzally, Alison, as your graduate student coordinator and advisor, along with Professor Neufeld. Another asset that Professor Varzally brings to this conversation is that she is also an editor, a book review editor for the Southern California Quarterly. And I think we will learn from her that really nothing teaches you more about writing than correcting the writing of other people. So being an editor, I think, is one of the ways in which you really get a whole new understanding of writing here. So, Alison, are you there?
I am here. Can you see me and hear me?
Well, because of the screen share, I don't think we can see you, but we have your picture here. So I think that'll be just as good. So Alison, can I ask you a couple of questions? That's the way I'm hoping we can do this, maybe for the first hour or so. We have a conversation, and then our participants can ask you some questions as well. Of course, participants, if you have questions in between, that's fine as well.
Sounds good. Good.
So what made you decide that you wanted to do something that has to do with writing?
It's a great question. I think I decided I wanted to write because I love to read. And that's probably a familiar story for many of you, that I grew up reading a lot. And it was that habit, I think, that made me wonder about the process behind the production of books. And I read books rather than kind of magazines or short stories. So I think that was the initial draw. And I think like a lot of young readers, I read series, right? So there were particular kind of characters and plots that I became familiar with, enchanted with. And then I don't know if I knew that I wanted a career in writing, but I always enjoyed writing more than other kind of strategies of problem solving and other creative activities. It was always very difficult, but very satisfying. And I think maybe, again, because I loved books, I wanted and loved stories, that I wanted to be on the other side of it. So my first job did not require that much writing, or the kind of writing that it required I didn't much enjoy. So my first job out of college was at the Department of Energy. I was working in the Office of Hearings and Appeals as an analyst. And although I believe in the possibilities of public service and really admire civil servants, that particular activity within the Department of Energy was the most kind of boring and repetitive and uninspiring. And the kind of writing that I had to do was very legalistic. It was defined by boilerplates and repetition, and there was no joy there. So that was writing that I did, but not the kind of writing that I wanted to pursue. And part of it, I think, because I disliked my job as a bureaucrat so much, and thought so little about what I was contributing, that I decided I was going to come back to graduate school, and kind of remembered my affection for history. And history is reading and writing. So that's, I guess, how I became a writer.
I am somewhat surprised to hear this. I think you shared this story before, but it never occurs to me to look at you and think of you as a former bureaucrat. Was that work in Washington, D.C.?
It was, and I have to say, and I know you spent a year there or a semester there. I think it's an incredible city. As much as we're disenchanted by kind of politicians of the moment, I think that kind of the work of government is so important. I think Washington, D.C. is such an incredible city in terms of, its culture and history, and the Smithsonian Museum is just unrivaled. So I loved that part of it. And the program that I was involved in, ironically, its intention was it was only supposed to be a 2 or 3 year job. So it had a specific end. And it hired individuals just out of college. And the idea was to build enthusiasm for public service and work in the federal government. And I think for many of us, it had the opposite effect, because what we were doing is processing oil refunds that dated to the Reagan administration. And we were calling up individuals who had submitted their claims 15 years prior. And it was an exercise of it seeming kind of futility. So I think, maybe if it had been a more kind of fulfilling part of federal government and public service, I wouldn't have gone back to graduate school, and I would have been kind of writing, or maybe writing less or writing differently. But that was my early start. And I think probably for a lot of our graduate students, that they have done something in between their undergraduate work and their graduate studies, that maybe just reinforces their desire to become a more polished historian through the master's program.
Now, writing for the Department of Energy in that function must have felt a lot like technical writing, where you basically use specific phrases, the words have to be just right. And I think one of the things that we dislike about bureaucracy is the functionality of the vocabulary, that they have to be very specific words, and they have to be used just in the right way, because to just conclude a sentence with "you get my meaning" is not going to be good enough. Did that teach you anything about the virtues of writing, or the difference between writing as simply a functional tool of communication and creative expression?
I think it did. I think it did. I think it reinforced my sense that there are certain kinds of writing that I find more persuasive, and also more pleasurable. And I think that's where the kind of the line of history, the kind of writing that we try to create, is certainly grounded in sources, and we are kind of a science in kind of the care with which we kind of analyze and cite those sources and try to kind of assemble a picture of the past. But we're also so concerned, I think, with how the story is told, that we want to bring some kind of joy, right, to the reader. So it's not just this kind of very, as you see, kind of functional delivery of information, but there is, again, a kind of pleasure in the reading that I think is because of the kind of writing. One thing I think, though, trying to write in that boilerplate, more kind of legalistic way may have helped me looking at one's kind of set of documents, right? So if I think I became more comfortable reading court cases as a source, because I had that practice trying to kind of write and read for these within this, essentially, which was a legal office of the energy department.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Is your writing now deliberately more colorful, creative, more engaged in metaphors, because of your awareness of how deadening technical language can be?
I think so. Yes. Yes. I mean, that's certainly my aspiration, right? To write what I want to read. And I think when I'm not reading history, I think what I like to read, it's not that I just like reading history, but in some ways that is the work that I do. So when I'm reading in my free time, I'm reading literature. And I think by reading literature, I think that offers kind of templates and models for the more kind of colorful, kind of poetic kind of writing that we aspire to. So it's always kind of a work in progress, but I think that's another kind of influence for a less technical, less legalistic writing.
We've had occasion recently to talk about the phenomenon that history is the quintessential discipline in HSS, because it's a humanity, it stands for the age, but it's also a social science. And I think most of our students know historical writing both as a very social, scientific language with a deliberate use of professional terminology that tries to sort of identify history as a discipline with aspirations to scientific rigor, but also know history as a creative exercise, where it's a book that you don't want to put down and you read until 3 o'clock in the morning, and like landscapes and worlds come alive in your head as you read. Something that, say the social history of, a colonial New England village of the 1820s that's written in the 1980s would just never generate. Is this part of your teaching practice, that you sort of try to flesh out these two sides of history, that the one department that really makes sense of our college?
I think so, and it's certainly when I have the opportunity to teach both 300B, I guess 490T, and then the graduate research seminar, when we talk about kind of writing, I definitely stress that the challenge for all writers, but maybe especially historians, because they have to be kind of true to their sources and they have to bring that critical rigor, but we're also attempting a kind of poetry, right? That we are concerned with the quality of the language, and we want we want our reader to kind of fall into the story. And that's really difficult, to be both the artist and also the scientist. But I think that's why so many of us are drawn to history too, because of that challenge. And I think it's the reason that there is such a popular audience for good history books too, in a way that there isn't much of a popular audience for, I think, the work of other disciplines like economics, for example, right? That's not something people read on their free time. But
no,
because of that storytelling power of history. Not that it's flattened to just description, right?
Yeah.
Those kinds of just narrative histories, but those that bring that analytical rigor, but then also just are kind of a pleasure to read.
Yeah, I noticed that Ben and Emily are among the participants, and I think there may be more that are in my current economic history class. And it's the discipline or the subject that so urges for a social scientific language. And yet we got to read Jane Kamensky's The Exchange Artist, which is a book on money. But I think it's very much written, yeah, there you go. It's in the spirit of the humanities. And I think that book, and maybe this came through in our class, but if not, then for those of you who are here, I'm hoping that you saw this, that if you think typically about the history of money, you think, well, this is going to be dry, this is going to be painful, there's going to be math involved, and it's going to hurt a little. But Jane Kamensky, you read about money, and it's as colorful as a murder mystery. And I think money and murder mystery often go together. Now, usually,
in terms of when I was talking about what got me excited about writing and it was reading, it was Agatha Christie really that kind of turned me kind of in that direction. So there you've got murder and money in force.
Yeah, and to stick with that metaphor about murder mystery and maybe detective work, usually I don't ask too many questions about the research because I want this to be about the writing, primarily because graduate students, I think we want to give you inspiration, commiseration in the final steps, or for any of you in the writing process. But given the current moment that we live in, I thought we should ask you also a little bit about your research. Now, I can't make any presumptions about you, but if I were to make them, I would say that you are of a sort of European immigrant background, not as recent as myself. I came here 21 years ago, but nonetheless, nothing in your background would suggest that, say, the history of race and ethnicity is sort of at the center of your work, or even more that you would write the story of Vietnamese children in adoption. And quite regularly, we are familiar with the idea that Asian American graduate students pursue a subject in Asian American history. That African American students, of course, feel drawn to African American history, and for Anglo-American, European American scholars, that we basically roam the field and go wherever we go. I guess I want to, and I wrestle with this because I write on prisons, and nothing in my history explains my particular interest in that subject. Mm-hmm. So, what drove you to that topic?
Yeah, no, and I think maybe you're saying that one more of those privileges of being white, of European descent, is the ability to roam, right?
Yeah.
And I think one of the flip sides of maybe someone who's Asian American being drawn to Asian American history is sometimes there's an expectation that is the history that they must study, right? So if you want to look at, German colonists and their participation in the American Revolution, that sometimes they're driven out of that field. So, but how did I get interested in immigration history? What I really wanted to be was a historian of China. I took a couple modern Chinese history courses. I hadn't taken any Chinese history courses in high school. You know, it was a pretty conventional curriculum. So we studied US history and we studied, then it was European history. I don't think we even studied world history. So when I got to college, I said, well, I want to study these other histories. So I took a course on modern China. I took a course on Vietnam, although it was taught at the time by a professor. He was a distinguished Asianist, but he was of the generation of American men that served or would have served in Vietnam during the kind of the U.S. intervention there. And so the class became less about the kind of the history of Vietnam and all about what Vietnam meant for Americans, right? So I think part of it is I was interested in Asian histories. And what I did not do, and I kind of really regret this, is I didn't learn Asian languages, right? And you can't study those histories with any kind of depth or confidence or conviction without having the languages. So then I thought, well, gosh, I'm interested in Asia, but I can't be an Asianist. I don't have the kind of the credentials and the preparation. So how might I kind of understand Asian history within the context of the United States? And so that's what led me to immigration history. And I studied at UCLA, and there were actually two historians there who studied kind of Asian immigration in some way. And there's a really, a revered Asian American kind of studies master's program there too. So that kind of reinforced, I think, my interest in immigration. There was a personal connection, as Volker suggested. Yes, I am of European descent. I think 3 of my 4 grandparents originated in Eastern Europe, in Poland, or what was the Austro-Hungarian Empire at the time. So I was interested in, I guess, my family and how what being Polish meant, and how over the course of generations that Polishness had become kind of muted. So there was a little bit of a personal connection to my becoming interested in immigration. And then there's also this very romantic idea of immigration, which I think we push up against in our courses, and it's premised on kind of the European immigrant experience, and really kind of forgets the patterns of kind of exclusion that non-European immigrants have suffered. But it really celebrates the United States as some kind of refuge or a place where these immigrants are kind of transformed and experience a lot of socioeconomic mobility. So I might have been kind of caught up a little bit in that romance, even though now I think as a scholar, I look more critically at that.
Yeah. Still the Golden Door is one of the titles that comes to mind for me from the 80s. Do you remember the moment where you were able to separate yourself from all the works that you were reading that gave compelling answers to which you could heartily nod? And the moment where you came up with a question and you said, you know what? No, I have a different question, and I want to intervene because that's such a difficult transition to make. And we're talking about this right now in 572 in the research seminar. How do you get from being convinced by answers and really getting wrapped up into them to asking your own question? Do you remember that moment when that happened?
I do, and it was in a kind of seminar on the history of the American West, and I don't remember what we were reading, but it was about kind of the interactions between kind of Anglo settlers and I think kind of Native Americans, and I thought, well, what would it be like, or what if the frame or the focus was not on how kind of Anglos are interacting with Native Americans or these other kind of non-Anglo groups, but what if you tried to kind of take the Anglos out of the equation for a little bit and looked at the interactions of these kind of minorities, right? Whether it be, indigenous peoples or African American migrants, certainly the Asian immigrants that I was interested in, what would that history look like? So that I think was what kind of first propelled me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I remember, so it came out of that kind of graduate seminar with conversations with other graduate students, and I think that my faculty advisor too, right?
So, as we all know, a lot of things are happening in immigration politics, in immigration policy, in matters of race. We are, I think, all highly aware that we are living an historical moment. All moments are historical, of course, but this one, I think, is prevalent. We are living in the kind of times that kids will ask us about in the future. Where were you? What happened? I think we can all prepare our oral history interviews to happen in 30 years from now. Do you look around yourself and see a lot of new historical questions arise out of what is happening right now, where you think the current moment actually makes me want to ask this question historically?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's
and you don't have to make these pitches now and give the participants research questions
right.
as options, but as you observe current events, does history often sort of echo in your head?
It does. I think one of the questions I think that I have, because my first book looked at these kind of coalitions that emerged among different minority residents of California. And by minority, I was defining as kind of non-white, but inclusive of kind of Jews at the time based upon their limitations in kind of employment and housing as well. So there were these kind of coalitions that came together in part because of shared residence, right? That these were minority neighbors who were living in proximity to one another, that their children were to some degree attending the same schools, and that they were witnessing and participating in the same historical events, whether they be the incarceration of Japanese or military service, or the Zoot Suit riots. So it was a very kind of heightened time, the way I think we're in a very kind of heightened, intense time. And those coalitions I found actually produced some really meaningful reforms, right? That some of the worst legal forms of discrimination in housing and education and employment were brought down. So I'm really interested in how these, what are really multiracial protests, how they might bring about change, and also to what degree kind of this generation is having kind of, to what degree there is a residential integration or an integration in schools that makes coalition building and compromise possible, right? One of the things that seems kind of very frustrating, I think, about American politics today, we all say this, is the divisiveness. But that divisiveness, I think, is reinforced by our segregation from one another, right? So it's not just kind of racial segregation, which I think persists, but it's kind of an ideological or political segregation. So you're living in places, for the most part, where there is kind of shared political commitments and values and ideas, right? And so I think that spatial segregation makes it really hard for us to kind of to cross over that divide, and to kind of see that other perspective as something more than kind of a caricature.
Mm-hmm. It seems like a long time ago that we talked about children in cages at the border. Some news yesterday brought this back into our memory, that this is, of course, one part of our present. The growing number of children that are detained at the border as part of a deterrent strategy, not just as a matter of emergency administration of immigration policy. And I wonder whether you look at this and think there is so much more history of children to write.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And especially kind of immigrant children. And I think other historians are increasingly doing that work of looking both at the experience of children, but also the way which children have been deployed rhetorically in discussions about, American power in Latin America and in Asia, and in what kind of immigration policy we should craft, right? Because we are making choices about who are the good immigrants and who are the less good immigrants. And that often children have been a preferred category or revered category. And at least in my work, especially if they can be detached from their biological parents, right? So I wrote about these Vietnamese children who were adopted by Americans during kind of the American phase of the war in Vietnam. And, American couples are absolutely driven by a sense of kind of altruism and a sense of kind of purpose and a belief that these children are needy, right? But many of them are also driven by kind of a critique of the American government and its presence in Vietnam, and see themselves as trying to kind of reverse a pattern of kind of bad American behavior in Asia. It's interesting, I think, thinking about connections to today's kind of detention of children at the border. I think oftentimes these children are relinquished or kind of sent by their families, not because their families obviously don't want them anymore, but because it is this incredible act of kind of compassion, I think, and hopefulness for their children. And I think in some ways Vietnamese families were doing the same, that many of the Vietnamese children that were adopted into the United States during those, that 10 years or so, many of them had been at orphanages, but in Vietnam, sometimes the families use those orphanages as a kind of daycare center, right? Especially given the turbulence at the time. And so the Vietnamese families didn't necessarily expect that their children would be adopted out of these orphanages. Or in some cases, it was a specific choice of Vietnamese families who saying, we can't offer the kind of the stability and the opportunities here, so we're kind of sending you to the U.S. And I think maybe what's different, Americans seem to be talking a little bit less, or some are talking less about these children, especially from kind of Guatemala and El Salvador and Nicaragua, as refugees, right? I think by holding them, imprisoning them at the border, it's not a kind of a welcoming that some of these Vietnamese children enjoyed. And part of it is because I think these children are recognized as still attached in some ways to their families.
The sources for this book, I presume, were primarily of adults. When you thought about how to source this story, did you think about the difficulty of telling the story of children without really telling the children's story?
Yes. Yes. Right. And for those of you who have studied oral history, have practiced oral history, right, you know, of course, about the challenges of kind of memory and remembering. So even if, of course, when you're asking these individuals about their childhood, what they remember is often unclear. It's absolutely fragmented. A lot of what they're talking about is what they've heard, right? I interviewed this is for a newer project, a Cambodian chef, and he was talking about being born in a Thai kind of refugee camp. But when he talked about it, it was all through what he had been told, right? So I guess the book is not, even though the word kind of children is there, it is about the memory of childhood rather than the experience of childhood. So it is
Hmm.
heavily kind of filtered. And
Hmm.
I think there is a, emerging subfield of, children's history, and probably those historians have wrestled more with those questions about how to really kind of tell a history from a child's perspective.
Hmm.
I think mine is as much how the children are used rhetorically, and then how those individuals kind of remember
Yeah.
their childhoods.
I realize, I hope you don't think that I was trying to tackle or somehow criticize the claim of the book. That wasn't,
No,
no,
not at
no.
all. Not at all. Not
But
at all.
I thought, we talk about, we talk about sources and how to find sources for your historical arguments. And of course, oral histories are an important part for you. Where else did you find sources for your work?
There is it's a social history welfare archives at the University of Minnesota that holds the records of the International Social Service, which was one of the agencies that was most heavily involved in international adoptions, right? And not just to the United States, but other kind of receiving countries, Australia and Europe. So I absolutely used those sources. There was a critical court case, and I was able to review not just kind of the case itself, but the kind of affidavits and the supporting documents. Those were at the National Archives in San Bruno. And then some other more kind of popular sources, because I was looking at this, through the 70s and 80s. So certainly newspapers and magazines that were talking about the story of Vietnamese children in aberrations. Time magazine, even some photographs. I think those were my most prominent sources.
And of course, I guess having been in the federal bureaucracy, you knew that there was bound to be something in the National Archives, in the federal bureaucracy somewhere. There was going to be a paper trail, right?
Absolutely, right. That's right. I hadn't thought about that. Right? You have an understanding that what the government does is it documents and hopefully does a good job, so you can then access those documents.
I think this is where we need to be grateful for bureaucracy, because they need everything written, they need everything documented, and the formality of it is a primary, literally a primary source, but also a primary source for us.
Yeah, no, that's right. I was just looking for my survey course. I was trying to introduce some sources that address the 1918 epidemic. And what I found most readily available were kind of the federal government commenting on the flu's impact on Indians in the federal boarding schools. So where there is state power, there is evidence of that state power.
I hope that the participants and those who watch this in the future will be interested and pick up your books. I think they are an example of how our department is not that that's a minor part teaching, but also actually creating fantastic research. Let's get back to writing a little bit. Writing is a learning process, and I'm sure that you agree that that's a process that really doesn't ever end. Do you remember your dissertation years? And I presume with anybody else, it was a matter of years of writing your dissertation, where you really had to understand, where you came to the conclusion that you had to learn how to write yet again.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I do remember it, and I remember a lot of doubts because I'd never written something of that scale, and I had never written something that seemed as important, and I hadn't written something with so much kind of independence or relative isolation, which didn't mean that I wasn't regularly checking in with my advisor. And I think I had a group where we shared drafts, but it felt more separate. So part of it, I think, was developing some kind of discipline and having confidence despite the doubts that you could do this kind of grander kind of writing.
I remember
very difficult.
I remember in my dissertation stage, there were friends and who'd say like, well, just try to write 3 pages a day. And then if you write 3 pages a day, you'll be done in a year, easy. And that doesn't work, does it?
I don't think so. 3 pages can be out. First of all, 3 pages can feel like a lot of pages, especially if it is so constant, right? If you're, again, as you're trying to write 3 pages per day. And then I think there's a kind of agonizing around length that can be counterproductive. Although I guess the sentiment is a good one, which is right? Because I think the hardest part is to start. And then once you've started, then inevitably there's some version of momentum, or you've done something, I guess you can tell yourself. But yes, the 3 pages per day to get to the end point, again, it makes it seem like writing is more formulaic than I think it is. I think it's the hardest work that we do.
Yeah. And I think the reason I always fought back against this because it was that I thought it's not difficult for me to put words on a page. I can write sentences, but I need to find the right words and I need to write the right sentences, and then I need to write them in the proper order. And all of that has to happen in your mind first. So it's the thinking and the processing that happens with the writing that makes it such hard work. Because sometimes just 2 sentences can be an incredible accomplishment, and then sometimes 5 pages they just flow because the pieces just fit together like a very easy puzzle, where you can see right away where things fit. And that's what I think is the difference between just writing words and just writing pages, the way you would do in college, where you don't particularly care, you just want to get it done. And when you write something that you have to own for your life, like a book, where you have to make sense, you have to really build something.
Yeah, and in that way, I think maybe we do a disservice to students, because most of the assignments that we set up through their undergraduate years are all about, okay, it's 12-point font and it's supposed to be 3 pages or this many words. So we suggest that it's about the quantity. And then if you're thinking about it as quantity, then as you said, then you miss what is the real difficulty, which is all the thinking, right? And until you get on the page, you haven't demonstrated that thinking, right? So it can feel like you haven't done anything, but you really have.
Yeah. Writing really is a thought process, rather than saying, okay, and now I'm going to write all this down. And this is what I'm often trying to. I think it happens a lot in 300A, a conversation about writing, where writing is quintessentially different in history than it is in, say, sociology or economics. Certainly in other disciplines like health or science, where language is used to convey something, to convey evidence that is somewhere else. So a sociologist may have a data table, and then they have the data set, and then they go on to describe the data. An economist looks at a set of data, output numbers, and then they have a formula, and then they just write up what they see there. Or, you know, a biologist would do this in a lab, where the science happens, or the scholarship happens elsewhere, and then you write it.
Yeah.
But in history, it doesn't work that way.
Yes, no, that's right. That's right. As much as we reveal our evidence, it isn't. It is kind of simultaneous, right? That we are kind of sharing that evidence as we are interpreting that evidence, right? That it's the two are inseparable from one another. As opposed to, right, the data table, and then here comes the analysis of the data table. That you're kind of holding those two pieces at the same time is the challenge.
I think that's good for students, for you guys as participants to remember, because when you feel that you can't write because it takes you forever and it's so difficult, it's because you're doing at least two things at once. And any friend of yours who works in economics, and I'm saying this because I had a friend in economics who would ask me how many papers I'd written, and I'd say in the last 3 years, 1. And he had written with friends. He writes one every month, but they're not the kind of writing that you wanna experience. They are reports. They are written the way we write our emails, right? They write up something that happens elsewhere, and that's a whole different ballgame. You know, he doesn't sweat over an intro paragraph. That doesn't happen in economics. You don't craft your introduction. You don't try to set up a context. Those things don't take place there. Let me ask you something else about the writing process. Your note taking. How do you approach note taking?
It has changed over time, and I would say I am less enthused about my current note taking because I'm working on this newer book project, and I'm kind of regretting that I'm not using my methods of the past. So I used an old-fashioned note-taking system, and I'm sure there's so many kind of better iterations. It was called Ask Sam, right? And it basically it was almost as if you took the old school note cards, right, where you wrote kind of the subject and the title and then kind of the contents, and then you would try to kind of shuffle the note cards and spread them out in different fashions. So this allowed you to do that to some degree kind of digitally. And the cool feature, you know, back in the 90s is that you could kind of search for words, right, across essentially the note cards. So I think the note taking is tricky, right? Because sometimes you're not exactly sure. You're not always sure what you're looking. You should be sure what you're looking for, but even if you have kind of a question, sometimes in your first encounter with that source, you're not lifting everything that you need or kind of the right pieces. It's almost like the return to the source is kind of necessary as the project evolves. So I think probably a good note-taking would somehow preserve that source in its integrity, right? And so I know increasingly it's possible to hold that digital source, right, in your kind of collection, and then kind of filter and sort and organize. But there's also, I'm thinking, I think I don't have a coherent answer because I'm wrestling with myself on the note taking. But I think there's also ways in which you're in some ways kind of physically either kind of writing or kind of typing through a digital note taking system is your engagement with that source. So kind of it's important to, by lifting and commenting on what you're lifting, that becomes kind of your interpretation of the source rather than just your having the source. And I think it's probably good to do that before you start writing.
Yeah, Yeah, that's what I'm thinking too. That and that's something I think you have to sort of arrive at in as a student. That note taking is not just a short version, a short record of the primary source that you then later turn to your notes and then start interpreting. The interpreting happens in the note taking because you are making selections. The selection process is intensive. It's intense when you do your note taking. What do you write down? What order do you put it? Then how do you sort your notes? All of those are methods of selection that don't have to be the same with every person. So right there in the process of the way you write things down and the way you observe things in the writing and the way you then sort them, prioritize them, and line them up, all that is one creative process that is that's dependent on individual perspective, even before the writing takes place.
And I think what's really helpful, and this maybe seems obvious, is to make sure you have a question that you're asking at the stage when you are finding and interpreting your primary sources, because it is so easy to just get caught up in the neatness of the source, right? And like, oh wow, this is really interesting, right? Because you're all history students, so you are interested in the past. But you have to be, again, selective. You have to be choosy about those sources, because if not, you'll be lost in the weeds. So I think the one thing that might kind of keep you kind of focused and aware of your surroundings is if you have, again, a question that you're asking. Again, not just that I'm exploring, women's suffrage, but what is that question? And I think the more refined the question is, the more kind of efficient you'll be with your primary sources.
Yeah. That discipline with the question is a hard one. And I can tell you, I didn't have that when I did research for my dissertation back then. I gobbled everything up like I had a scanner pen, which at the time was a neat technology where you could sort of take down verbatim quotations. An OCR reader didn't work all that well. But I took down so much. Everything I thought, ooh, I know this is not the question, but this is also really interesting. So I picked up so much where if I ever had the time to do it, I could write yet another book that elsewhere in the sources. And often I was just wowed by something and didn't quite know how to make it fit, but it just wowed me. And I know that's not enough. And I tell you guys all the time, the participants, that it's not enough to just have something that's curious. And I learned this actually the other day. And Lainey, one of our participants, she's in the 572 class. She has an interest in horse history, of horses, and she has, I think, a really good disciplined approach. And I was dabbling around trying to give her something, and I actually didn't. I think I didn't quite understand what her interest was about because I gave her pictures, a story about horse divers. They sit on horses. It started in the 1880s, went to the 1950s, and they jump from a tower into a small pool with a horse. It's nuts. It's absolutely nuts when you look at this. And these horses are terrified, but they train them to ultimately do this and basically go completely against their instincts. And I gave this to Lane. I thought, oh, this has got it. And I was wowed by it, but it didn't actually hold the sort of the analytical interest of what Lainey's work's about. And so I think Lainey did the right thing to say, this is incredibly curious and wow. But ultimately, Lainey, you stayed with your interest. I think that was the right call to make.
Yeah, that could be for another project. Right?
Yes. Maybe this will sort of way in the back of your head.
I am definitely interested in, because German horse history is fascinating. I had no idea that existed. And I saw that and I was like, oh my goodness, what were these people thinking?
Although, the article I gave you was German, but that's American. This kind of stuff happened in Atlantic City.
Oh, yeah, you're right. Yes.
It was a sort of a Coney Island kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like
So-
very much circus oriented.
Well, when you're working towards tenure, you can pick that up again. Alison, let me ask you about your experience with editors and your work as editor. When you have something ready to submit, are you looking forward to hearing back from the editor, or are you dreading it?
Oh, that's a good question. I think it depends on the editor, to be honest, and I think there is considerable variation. I would say the editor for my first book, to be honest, was indifferent at best. And so I think that I would submit and I wouldn't hear and I have to pester. And I think that as a writer, especially at that stage, but I think even now, you always have kind of doubts. And so if those doubts are reinforced by a less attentive editor, not for the good.
That was University of California Press, right?
It was.
Okay.
Okay. And I think part of it, these editors are super busy, and especially when you're kind of a first-time author, I think that they have priorities maybe. But the editor for my second book, who actually, he had worked outside academia. I think he had worked, was it business writers? But he had a different approach. I think he was much more responsive, much less leisurely, I think, than kind of the first editor, and just really kind of direct but gentle all the same. So I think I was always kind of apprehensive but excited to submit work. When I have submitted to journal articles, I think there is a sense of uncertainty. You really want it to get accepted, and you don't. Part of it is like, I don't want to hear about any revisions. I just want to be done. I worked really hard on this. I think I've got it together, and I've gotten back some really constructive feedback. And my first thought was, oh, this is going to be so much work, and I wish it was done. But then if you can kind of pause and reflect and integrate the comments of a good editor, it opens up the work in a way that you didn't expect. And so you come to really appreciate that kind of honest, direct criticism, because it shows a care and an engagement. And Volker, you were talking about how other disciplines, their work is very clearly and explicitly collaborative, right? My husband is an economist, so yeah, he's writing a lot of papers, and there's always at least 3 authors or 4 authors. And then of course they have to jockey about whose name is the first. But I think in history, this is our work. The work tends to be lonelier. And so the way that it, I think, becomes less lonely is through kind of the feedback of your peers and the editor. And that's why when you read those acknowledgements pages, which I didn't used to do, but now I do, I think you find out so much about the writing process and the way in which this work by a single author is actually more collaborative than you might have thought, because of that input from editors and other kind of other historians.
Mm-hmm. Now you are the book review editor for the Southern California Quarterly, and I guess that job entails acquisition, meaning recruiting book reviewers. Mm-hmm. And what does the review process look like?
Yeah.
Or rather, the editing process.
The editing process. So I think one of my favorite parts is that I think I'm much more familiar with the historical literature about the Far West and its attended regions than I was before being book review editor, even though I should have been completely on top of and aware of that literature. So, some of the publishers, right, there's certain publishers that are very clearly within those kind of geographic and conceptual boundaries. So they will just send me the books, and then it's a matter of kind of matching it with an appropriate kind of author. But in other cases, like maybe it's, I'm trying to think, like UNC Press where I published, or NYU Press, right? Strong academic presses, they don't produce a lot about the history of the American West in California, but occasionally there will be a work. And so, but they're not kind of primed to send the book to the Southern California Quarterly. So there it's like perusing the catalog and kind of seeing the ways in which certain books would fit our limits. How you find the reviewers, and I should say I've actually, I usually use the bibliography. I think my predecessor, she kind of created a list of willing reviewers over the course of 5 to 6 years, and then she would kind of refer to that list. I don't have a list. I usually start fresh, just looking at which works were most kind of referenced by this author that are part of the field, and with the presumption that those are the works, or the authors of those works are most kind of prepared, have the kind of the best credentials for reviewing it. And some people say yes immediately, and a lot of folks will say, no, thank you, I am overwhelmed, right? I've got a lot of other commitments. So it's a little bit of kind of chasing down a willing individual. I have had, and I try to make sure that some graduate students also have the opportunity of reviewing books, and they are certainly the most timely in the delivery of their reviews compared to, tenured or tenure track faculty. I don't know if you know Michael Yabiso. He started a doctoral program at University of Oklahoma, and so he's reviewing the book for the Southern California Quarterly. And then in terms of once the review comes in, what I notice is a great range, frankly, in the quality of the writing, and even from, fairly established scholars, and it might be because the review was written fairly kind of quickly and without a level of care. So sometimes it is unexpected that some of the reviews are weaker than others. I think also there is a tendency sometimes in book reviews to summarize as opposed to really evaluate and assess the book. And that's what I think you want the book review to do.
Yeah, I've noticed that too, that I've read reviews of people that I thought were really sort of at the top of the field and clearly wrote that review maybe like a well-crafted email, not like a small essay. Now, when you edit these, do you actually do editing in the sentences, or do you hand this straight over to the copy editor for punctuation and grammar?
Yeah, I do a little bit of the line edits, but not that much. In fact, I don't think that that's my forte, but the copy editor is really good. So she'll catch kind of the punctuations. I mean, what I read for is clarity. Does it make sense? And then I would say she reads for, the finer kind of points of grammar.
Mm-hmm. Has the exposure to this wide diversity of writing quality and the book reviews, has that made you a more conscientious writer still?
I think so, maybe. I think so. That you decide you want to be more careful, right? Because you're always concerned about audience, right? That you're writing for others, and I think that you want to kind of write your best. Whatever you're writing. If it is an email, right? I think that what's striking to me is reading the emails that I get from my colleagues in the history department compared to readings that or emails that I get elsewhere. It's clear that the historians kind of even bring their concern about writing to the email format.
Yes. Okay. Let's switch gears here a little and go to sort of some practical tips and advice. And I singled out one, and that's the challenge of procrastination. Is that something you do?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And part of it is, you can feel very positive about your procrastination because you have other kinds of work that you need to do. And especially when you're researching also, if that's some of the work that you're doing, there's always one more book that you could consult or one more source that you could search for. And I think you can reassure yourself that you are therefore working, which you are, but what you really need to be doing is sitting down and writing. And so, yes, I definitely procrastinate. And I think also, frankly, in the midst of our kind of continued crisis, because writing is so hard, because it is a creative activity, and I think it is hard to be creative amidst all this anxiety, or when you are anxious. So I think the procrastination is probably more pronounced. So how to get around that? Well, first of all,
I was going to share with you, Professor Neufeld. He said that when you know that he has a writing project ahead of himself when his apartment is particularly clean.
Yeah, that's right. That's good. That's right. And now that we're all working from home, right, that there are more spaces to clean, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
We get to corners we never gotten to before.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
So how do you fight it? How do you get over it?
I think, trust that you've done it before, right? So kind of have that confidence that you have written and you have concluded assignments. And then if you can decide, and ideally in advance, are there certain times of day, or there are certain days when you are going to set aside for the writing, right? And a certain amount of time that you are going to commit to writing. Because then you're not going to kind of, cheat yourself by filling that time with other kinds of work. So maybe, I know some colleagues really like to write early in the morning, or they decided that, Friday is my writing day. So if you can make an arrangement, create a structure for yourself, I think that can be really helpful.
Do you switch off your email, your internet?
Where I used to write, when we were allowed to kind of move around, I would either write at the public library, but you had, in order to get on the internet there, you had to go and get the code. So I kind of just chose not to get the code. Or I would write at the park, where again, you'd have to work to get on internet. So yes, I have done that by kind of cutting yourself off, and that actually is very effective.
Do you work in silence, or do you try to drown out other noises with music or something like that?
I don't work with music. I've never been able to write with music. I mean, I think I could probably do other kinds of work, but maybe not even that. So I like quiet. I can handle white noise. I really don't like coffee shops. Again, when we were allowed to go to coffee shops and sit outdoors, because I think there's too much variation in the noise levels and too many interesting conversations happening that are kind of drawing away. So I don't mind writing in kind of public places, but there has to be kind of quiet, or the noise has to be constant.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember working in coffee shops, and I was frequently annoyed by how bad the conversations were that were happening around me, and it angered me so much that I had to put my headset on and find some music. But then that distracted me too. So ultimately, that's not a solution.
That's
now,
right.
What other writing tips can you give? The kind of stuff that you want to write on a Post-it and stick to the side of your screen. I don't know whether people still do that.
Oh yeah, what other writing advice besides the kind of the space and the distraction? I mean, sometimes just encouragement, which might seem kind of cheesy, but whether you can do it, or keep at it, or maybe the name of a book that you most admire and most wish you had written or will write. So something that you're kind of referencing or kind of thinking about. But yeah, positive words of encouragement. Maybe, I don't know, a picture of someone that you really care about. Maybe,
do you use something like a whiteboard or something else where you we see this in crime stories where people, if they try to put a case together, they put all the pictures of the suspects up, and then the incidences, and then either they draw a line on the board, or craftier, they put pins in it, and then they use string, and all of a sudden out comes this mesh. Do you visualize things for yourself in that way?
I wish I was that sophisticated. I thought about getting a
doesn't have to do with yarn. I mean, you can do this.
No. I do break from the digital, so I definitely will kind of write by hand, or I will print out drafts, and then I find writing on the draft is very helpful, especially when I'm for organization, because I find, especially when it's a longer piece, it's harder for me. I can tell that the pieces are not fitting, there's something wrong with the sequence, but it's really hard for me to get that right unless I kind of print out and then I kind of see it and kind of read it that way. And then I, use different probably colored markers or notes to myself, say move this there, move that there. It might be different though for this generation, because I still remember my first essays, I wrote them out on the legal pages, right? And so I might still have that habit of kind of physical writing and find that satisfying. But maybe if you grew up always writing by typing, it might be a different experience.
Do you find something substantively different writing by hand? Is there something happening differently when you write by hand?
I think so. I mean, if you think that writing is a way of thinking, I think the format of the writing can shape the thinking. Sometimes it just feels more satisfying. It's obviously much harder to edit, but sometimes figuring out your ideas just in a more skeletal, basic form, I think can be achieved through that kind of physical act of, holding the pen and having the pages.
Yeah. I remember when I worked as a radio reporter, there was in the latter 90s, so 96 to 99, and there were the old school reporters that came with a pen and paper, and then there were the young whippersnappers like myself that came with a digital recorder, and then the laptops that existed at the time, and then you needed your extra modem for the PCMIA slot to put that into the laptop, and it was all very elaborate, where you would ultimately type up your report and then email it, which was quite the operation in the latter 90s compared to now. And you would type and type and type, and then edit and cut out and rephrase and reorganize. And the old guard, they would take their pen and they would write it out. They might maybe strike out a word or two, but that was it. They would write it out, and they were able to conceive of one coherent 1-minute bit in their head and put it down on paper. And they really made us look like fools, because that the processing power that we relied on the computer, they all had that. They had that in their head to sort of compose and put sentences down and keep something in mind. And then they didn't need to have everything digitized, and that always stuck with me. There's something about handwriting, even though I don't do it much, where I know that something happens cognitively. I think that's of a higher order somehow. And I'm not saying this as a Luddite at all. All right. So I think we should make room for some questions because we have taken up quite a bit of time, and I am sorry for contributing my anecdotes that make this longer. So, any questions you have for Professor Varzally, or generally? We'd love to hear them. Maybe you're in a particular point in your writing where you have a question. Yes, Emma.
Hi. So I think something I struggle with a lot with my writing is I'm fine with crafting an argument and getting the point across, but I think I always somewhat struggle with making it not a boring read, because I think maybe in undergraduate I was told, like, don't make your paper sound like an English paper, history, not very flowery language. So I don't know if you have any suggestions or what you do to make it more appealing for the reader as you go along.
Yeah, that's a great question. And maybe it's thinking about writing as a process of layering, right? So the fact that you are able to kind of construct an argument and deliver that argument and support it with evidence, that's fantastic, right? So I wouldn't take that away. I think it's more kind of the addition. So I would certainly do that first, kind of, and then, part of it is that the historian, this is where kind of historian is creative or uses the imagination. And I think historians are a little less kind of strict and rigid around that possibility, where they're willing to speculate a little bit within the bounds of the evidence, to really kind of imagine not just what's on the page, but what that individual might have done earlier in that day, right? Based upon the time period. So, what clothes might have they put on? What might they have been thinking about? And I think when you start to kind of, put yourself into the kind of the positions of the historical actors that you're writing, then maybe the kind of the details kind of emerge, and you can layer that onto the argument and the evidence. And then sometimes also, I think I write, and a lot of students write, and the first draft, you're just kind of putting your evidence in, you're putting your sources in, but you're not really elaborating upon, explaining, interpreting those sources. So sometimes it's going back to, what else can I say, right? How do I put this source into kind of a bigger, broader context? And I just practice, I think, too.
Yes. It just takes a lot of trying, and I think it's important to not get disheartened when you get a paper back that has, you thought that metaphor was just excellent, or you thought that was really funny, and your professor doesn't get it at all, and just there's no appreciation, and it just gets shut down. Don't lose heart. That's going to happen for a long time, but it's going to happen less, and there's going to be more successes. Ben.
Yeah, hi. I guess it's not really much of a question, but kind of going off what you guys were talking about, what I guess I just wanted to share that what helped me with writing in general is actually taking creative writing class. And that going with Emma's question, like how to deliver content in more engaging and different ways and using language in creative ways, I thought was really helpful for me, because I also struggle with that a lot too. I mean, I wouldn't say I'm an expert at that at all, but just learning about different ways of delivery was really helpful. So I guess I just want to encourage people to try that out if they have time.
That's a great idea. Yeah, I'm Volker, I don't know if you've had Gail as part of the series on writing, but I know her most recent book is, it's historically grounded, it's strong in its evidence, but it's deliberately literary, right? So she is trying to be kind of creative and draw on those techniques, I guess, that Ben studied. And if you think about what are the historical books that sell most, they are even kind of historical fiction, right? Where you take what is and historians would agree is an event that occurred, but you kind of elaborate and riff on it. So, we're not going to quite go that far maybe as history students, but I think that reading those works might be a good template too, or model to borrow from.
Chantal, I'm going to get to you in a second, but you gave me an idea or reminded me of something. Because I have a long commute, or used to have a long commute, listen to a lot of audiobooks, and it's actually a good way to engage because it shows you the language that works, that generates images. So if you hear a sentence and something appears in a mental image, that's good writing. And historical fiction or other good fiction can teach you how that's done. And last year I listened to Colson Whitehead's Underground Railroad and Colson Whitehead's Nickel Boys, both of which are phenomenal to read, but also great to listen to, because you really sort of in your ear get to appreciate word choices, momentum, drama, the balance between short and long sentence, the good imagery, the quiet puns or ironies. So when you're actually listening to a book, it's like listening to a story. Is actually, I think, I thought it was a good experience, a good exercise. But yes, Chantal, you wanted to ask a question.
Yes, hi. Going back to number 7, I think I struggle the most with, I know what I want to talk about, I have everything in hand, and once I get to my screen, I don't know how to actually type it and all that, so it ends up to me procrastinating until the end, until I rush something. And I know I can't type 3 pages per day practicing, so what would you suggest as maybe twice a week you spend an hour and a half practicing or something like that, so I won't fry my brain?
Well, it's hard because in some ways it's so individualized, right? You don't want to set up kind of a structure that you're not going to be able to work within, right? You set out it's so kind of ambitious, or it's so contrary to your rhythms. But I think the idea of writing for a shorter period of time, as opposed to I'm going to spend the whole day writing, that can be real, because it's so mentally intense, because it's so creative. I think writing in kind of smaller pieces, I mean, not so small, because I think it does take a while for you to kind of settle in. But I think maybe try 2 hours twice a week and see where you get from there. And then I think if you feel like you've got things in hand, you have your ideas, just write, even if it is complete junk coming out on the page. Because once you kind of break that resistance, I think you can get some kind of momentum, and you can always change what you have written, but you've got to write something first.
Mm-hmm.
Professor Neufeld, when we spoke in spring, he said that he sometimes starts writing by hand because it reduces his inhibitions. When he sits in front of a screen, typing something on the screen, it gives him the feeling it has more permanence. And to basically separate yourself from your words and put it out there into the computer has a lower threshold of maybe your own tacit expectations that it be something. But if you just take a legal pad or a notepad and you start writing things down, and you just have to put the sentence there because you were writing, you can't shuffle words on a piece of paper. Maybe that gets you going. And then if you get in the mood, you say, hey, this is actually quite good. Then you can move back onto the screen. The other advice that I would give you is to make sure that you don't think you need to start at the beginning. This goes a little bit against what I said about these old radio reporters who were able to tell a story from the beginning to the end exactly in that order. But sometimes we have one moment in our history that we feel really clear on, You don't need to work your way to that. You can write it right down and then make that your target to write towards. Any other questions? Advice? Maybe you guys have advice, something that really worked for you. Oh, Max, yeah, please go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, when writing your thesis and getting your argument put in place, I struggled a lot with, doing my research and building my thesis. And as I'm doing the research, kind of realizing that my argument starts to kind of shift based on that, on the research that I'm doing. Does that happen a lot? Because I feel like I start with an argument that I think is pretty strong based on the research that I've already done. But then as I keep doing that, I find other things, and I'm kind of, I don't know if it's just my mind or second guessing myself in a sense of switching, going around that argument. How do you battle that? Because I feel like that kind of slows the writing down a little bit, because it's you kind of realizing that maybe your argument is not as strong because of the research that you're doing, and it's kind of starts to go away a little bit or starts to shift. How do you battle that?
Yeah, no, I think that's good. I think to be open to the other arguments that are kind of emerging as you are reviewing and writing your research. So instead of being kind of fixed to your original argument, if you can be adaptable and flexible, and maybe see it less as a battle and more as a kind of a shifting process, then let those, I think, other arguments emerge, right? Which I think is really hard, because I think you want that certainty, you want that control, but I think even as you're writing, because it is an act of thinking still, you can be figuring it out, and that means changing, I think, what you thought you were writing.
Mm-hmm.
I think that goes back also to the idea that writing for an historian is actually producing the historical argument in the writing, not having one and then writing it down. So as you write your argument, as you craft your historical evidence, and as you make your point, in the process you refine it. And this may, for other disciplines, this happens in the lab or in the data set, in the experiments, in the math that they apply to the data set. I don't know what they're doing. Something along those lines. But for you, it's all happening on the paper in the way that you write this down. And as you write it down, things become clear. You don't look at a clear picture and then describe it. You are creating the picture, So, I think it's a sign of intellectual progress to see your argument refine and possibly even shift. But it's more painful because the expectation is that you're writing something down that took place in your head or in your notes, and maybe we need to rethink the process there.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for your question. Any other questions? No, it doesn't look like it. Well, that is perfectly timed by everybody, because this is exactly 1.5 hours, and I enjoyed this. Thank you so much, Allison. And
super fun.
Thank you, everybody, for participating. It was great for you to be here. Friday, 5 p.m. That's not a no-brainer in terms of participation, so I value that all the more. Oh, there is one more comment. No, it was a thank you. Okay, good. Well, you're very welcome, Emma. Thanks. All right. So look out for our next meeting. That will happen in early November, and I will give you a heads up in an email. There will be one in November, one in December, and hopefully that will continue next year as well. So have a good weekend and take care. See you soon. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you so much.
Professor.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Allison.
Thank you, Volker. Thanks for the invite. That was really engaging. Now I should go right?
Take care, all.
Bye-bye.